Okay, home stretch, and we have hit at week 10, the hardest part of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13. Now, this chapter, laden with apocalyptic language and eschatological undertones, it stirs up a lot of conversation. But like most, let's be honest, like all scripture passages that are apocalyptic in nature, there is an inherent temptation surrounding it. And that is to get distracted in trying to pinpoint exactly what it means, like it's some sort of a bus schedule or a train timetable. And by so doing, miss the actual point being made. That being said, this chapter has a lot of different interpretations of what Jesus could be talking about. And each, school of thought about this tends to pivot on one or another key verses. And I've even learned about an interpretation I'd never heard before this week. Some think that he's talking strictly about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Some think that he's actually talking about his second coming. The new one that I learned about is they think he's actually talking about the crucifixion, which they have some interesting points, but it doesn't cover nearly enough. And of course, many will say there's some of the fall of Jerusalem and there's some of the second coming, and there are layers of interpretation. That one I tend to lean toward because every apocalyptic passage I've ever studied has these different layers of application where it might apply to something in its immediate time period, but it also then echoes, foreshadows something yet to come. So let's begin at the beginning of chapter 13, as they are leaving the temple. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" Well, we're going to stop there right off. That initial exclamation, "What wonderful stones, what wonderful buildings." I've read descriptions of it came to be known as Herod's temple, even though he wasn't the one that built it. He just expanded upon it. And it is said that it rivaled the known 7 wonders of the world. White stone blocks. Some of them, I think, some of them 42 feet long. We're talking massive stones. And the entire complex covered something like 35 acres of land. From a distance, they said that it made Mount Zion look like a snow-capped peak. And of course, Josephus is the one who described it as Herod's improvements to the temple left nothing that could have possibly marveled the mind or the eyes. And so when the disciple is saying these things, there's not just an aesthetic awe going on here. There is a ringing note of nationalism. You see, their pride in the temple and Jerusalem was such that, I mean, it would lead to charges of blasphemy if anyone foretold the destruction of either. We'll see this later on in Mark. One of the charges against Jesus was that he blasphemed against the temple by saying that he would tear it down and rebuild it in 3 days. And when Stephen, first martyr, he's accused of following the man who blasphemed against. You see where it's going. And most of his defense to them is talking about how God spoke to, was present with his people long before the temple or Jerusalem existed for them. That they are not synonymous with the God who, for a time, set his name and his presence among them. But you can hear in the voice of the disciple, look, isn't this magnificent? So it must have been a shock for Jesus to say to him, yeah, you see all this greatness, but it's all going away. And of course, I'm sure others heard this. We know others heard this because when he comes out of town and he sits down in one of their favorite places, Mount of Olives, and it says opposite the temple, but apparently you had a beautiful panoramic view of the temple from the Mount of Olives. I've been told that today you get to see the Muslim buildings now, but it's an excellent view of what they're talking about. And for his 4 original disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John, they ask him privately. And the question they ask is kind of telling. When will these things be? As in, when will this travesty happen to the temple? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? You don't see it in Mark, but in the other synoptic gospels, particularly Matthew, there's a little bit more detail. He phrases their question, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? And there is some thought that they are really unable to imagine the current world without the temple. So they're actually asking, what will be the sign for the end of the world? They presuppose that the world cannot really exist without the temple. It's just, that's what it sounds like. And so Jesus, I love that his first and probably most important reply to them is, see that no one leads you astray. You remember the last time in Mark, somebody asked him for a sign? It was the Pharisees. Give us a sign that shows that you have the authority to do all these things. And he said to them, no sign for you. And here they are saying, what are the signs that the temple's going to be demolished and the world's going to end? So his first thing is see that no one leads you astray. You see, an obsession with signs tends to make one vulnerable to any false Christs and false prophets, as we'll talk about later, who will come along and say that they know, that they have the answer. He says, many will come in my name saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars, rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. These must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. When I was reading this, and I was sitting thinking, so first, don't let anyone lead you astray. Second, don't mistake the commonplace dramatic troubles of the world for signs. And one commentator I was reading actually said, not all birth pangs are genuine labor. Some of them are false labor. But the natural conclusion that some people draw is, well, if my world is falling apart, then must mean the world is ending. But you remember Elijah on the mountain, ready to die, and it's like, I can't take any more. And he experiences certain rather flamboyant phenomena. The earthquake, the storm, the wind, and the Lord is not in any of those, but in the whisper, the still small voice. And Jesus is saying, you want signs? Those aren't it. Wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, those are not signs of the end, though many people like to interpret them as such. But, and he will repeat this phrase, be on your guard. So right along the same lines, to see that no one leads you astray. But in this case, he says, they will deliver you over to councils. You'll be beaten in synagogues. You'll stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Are these signs? He doesn't say. He just says, keep watch, be on guard. In this case, for persecution as his disciples. He's gone, you would think, off the route of the answer to their question. When will these things be? And what are the signs that they're about to be accomplished? But here's where the question of, is he talking about the fall of Jerusalem? Is he talking about the second coming? Is he talking about both? Because we know from a timeline that, right, go through Acts, they were handed over to local Jewish councils and beaten in the synagogues. And they stood before governors and kings and testified. And by the end of the book of Acts, when Paul reaches the city of Rome, he considers that as having reached the entire known world. He talks in his letter to the Roman churches before he ever arrives there that he's looking for a new place to preach the gospel where no one else has preached it before. And he's thinking of going all the way up to the frontiers of Spain. And family members betrayed disciples. Brother delivers brother over to death. The father his child, and the child will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you'll be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And of course, the discussion is the end of what? Are they talking the end of the world? Is this the second coming? Or are they talking the end of life? He doesn't say. Just the end, whatever your end may be. And for them, it was the end of life. And here we get to the really difficult part, where he drags in the prophecies of Daniel. When you see the abomination of desolation, that phrase just makes me cringe, because everybody's all like, we must figure out what that is. I'm like, must you? Really? In Daniel, there is a figure that comes to be known as the abomination that causes desolation. And in the immediate context, it is thought that this refers to one of the Antiochuses. I think it's Antiochus IV, who, upon entering Jerusalem, raised a pagan altar on top of God's altar and slaughtered, we think, probably pigs on it. But there are so many interpretations. And this is a pivot moment. When you see this mysterious thing or person standing where it or he ought not to be, in the Greek, the gender of the words doesn't match, and so it's kind of ambiguous. And of course, let the reader understand. I always think it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek thing. It's like, really? Does the reader understand? Because this reader doesn't really understand. But it's a warning. When you see this, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, this is completely opposite of what normally happens in times of danger. In the ancient world, when the danger threatened, you ran to the walled cities for defense. Here, Jesus is saying, run to the wilderness, run to the mountains, run anywhere but to the city. And here's where it's thought he is explaining to them about the fall of Jerusalem, because this actually happened. Jerusalem came under siege, but before that happened, in fact, 3 years before the fall of Jerusalem, there's a story goes, and some people are like, oh, that couldn't possibly be true. That must be legend. But the story goes that somebody in the Christian community had a vision saying, flee to a certain town outside of Jerusalem, on the other side of the Jordan, so that by the time Jerusalem came under siege, the Jewish Christians had more or less evacuated and escaped what happened to their Jewish neighbors. And the terms in which Jesus says this are urgent. If you're on your housetop, don't go down inside to pack stuff, just go. If you're in the fields, don't go back even to get your necessities, like your jacket. Just go. And woe to women who are pregnant and nursing in those days, and pray that it may not happen in the winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as not been seen from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. you can see where the language kind of fluctuates, and you're like, well, this could be Jerusalem, but that's, I mean, it sounds a little strong to say that what happened there will never happen again. We know from history it did happen again. Which is what gives rise to there may be overtones of the second coming here. It is possible. Because he says, if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. This is again where the danger of being obsessed with signs comes up, because there will always be someone, wherever there's a demand for signs, who's willing to market some. But not all signs and wonders are from God. But what does he repeat at the beginning of this section and at the end? Be on guard. Watch yourselves. Don't fall for the charlatans. Don't look to what the world says is safety for your safety. Trust in his word. Take him at his word. But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. And that certainly doesn't sound like the fall of Jerusalem. But the apocalyptic language, of course, there are a lot of people who, I think with a wince of the Left Behind series, who would like to trace these through as a schedule. That will be, I don't know how to even put it, that every eclipse is a sign of the end times, that it's just, yeah. But he tells two parables at the end of this section. One of them suggests that at least part of what Jesus has told them will have perceptible, interpretable signs preceding it. That's the parable of the fig tree. And you remember I said in the Bible, fig trees aren't always just fig trees. I think this is one of those cases where it is just a fig tree, because the fig tree itself is an object lesson. He says, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out leaves, you know that summer is near. He's given other likenesses. When people ask for signs, it's not in Mark, it's in the other Gospels. But for example, he says, you know, if the sky has a certain appearance, you know what the weather is to follow. And yet you can't interpret the signs of the times. Here he's saying, you know how when you look at a fig tree and you see that the branches are starting to put out leaves and you know it's close to being summertime? So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. And then, one of those really hard things. Truly, I say to you, which is his emphatic, like, listen, this is absolutely certain. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place, which makes it kind of important to understand what he means by all these things. Because if he's talking about the second coming, then he was wrong. Which leads some people to choose to try to, do some serious verbal gymnastics with the word generation. And leads others to say, well, this parable is probably about the bit about the fall of Jerusalem, which is true. By 70 AD, there were still people alive who had walked with him and listened to him, and they would see all these things take place. A troubling verse, and I do not have an answer for you. But it suggests that some part of what he's saying is not only imminent, meaning it's going to happen soon, but it's also going to have signs that they are, if they're watching, should be able to notice and interpret and prepare. And then heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. The certainty of what he says is even more permanent than the creation itself. And then there's the other parable. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And here again, be on guard. Keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It's like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he suddenly come and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. So there's a second parable here that says some part of what Jesus is talking about. There is no sign. There's no warning beforehand. It just happens. And he's not advocating sleep deprivation. Stay awake means keep alert, be on your guard. Always be ready. In earthquake-prone areas, I'm thinking particularly of Japan, they actually have a kit in the household ready. It's got canned food, bottled water, different necessities, a lamp, batteries, all sorts of things. Because when an earthquake hits, you get very little warning. And so they're ready. They train. What do you do when you first feel the tremors? Where do you go? How do you keep in contact with your family, your loved ones? They're on guard against it because they don't know when it's going to happen, but they know it's going to happen. Likewise with that day, that hour. And this is the bit that really does sound like the second coming. And it's interesting, though I don't know that it's particularly important, that he says not even he knows when that's going to happen. Only the Father knows. That he has either emptied himself of that knowledge when he emptied himself of his glory, or that he has simply trusted the Father and never asked. But even he doesn't know when that's going to happen. He only knows what's important. And that is to be ready. This idea of being found asleep. Again, Mark abbreviates it. But if you go to Matthew or to Luke, since I'm closer to Matthew, I'll go there. Matthew 24. He says, "You must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed,' and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." This is right before the parables of, like the 10 virgins, 5 wise who brought oil for their lamps and were ready for when the bridegroom came, and 5 who were just like, hey, let's just go with the flow, and discovered that they weren't ready, and so they had to run off and get their provisions. And while they were off, bridegroom came and they were shut outside. Or the one who, the parable of the talents, you had 3 or 4, depending on your parable, servants were entrusted with a certain amount of money and told to do business with it till the master came back. And some of them did quite well, doubled their money. One of them, of course, was like, oh, I was afraid of you. I was in such awe of you that I didn't dare risk your money, so I buried it. Staying awake, being ready, doing what you have been charged to do, and doing it to the best of your abilities. When he comes, he will come with your reward. But getting distracted, getting bogged down by the things of the world, the fears of the world, the obsessions of the world, leads to judgment. Mark doesn't go into those details, but that final verse in chapter 13, "What I say to you, I say to all, stay awake." It's worth considering. What does it mean for us today to stay awake, to stay alert, to be on guard? That could be its own lesson, honestly. But we are coming up to a point where we see what it meant in the short term for the disciples. Because the Son of Man is about to be betrayed. And before that happens, he takes a few of them out and says, keep awake with me and pray. And they don't keep awake. He's left alone. And they flee, and he's left very much alone. But that's next week.